The Power of the Dog is a film I initially had some trouble with. The trouble, however, didn't lie with the performances or the direction or isolated setting, but with its lethargic pace. The first hour or so were a painful slog for me to get through on my first watch. I'd never seen a film from director Jane Campion before, but I knew immediately that I was in the hands of an assured, confident director. The power of the dog's pacing and the deep focus on character were choices I immediately respected from a filmmaking perspective, but still the film tested my patience, and I must admit it was a test I initially failed. But the boldness of Campion's style in an era of vapid, fast-paced flicks drew me back in for another viewing, and I'm very glad that it did. It's true that by popular standards, not much happens in The Power of the Dog. That is until the final act, where things begin to pick up rapidly. The subtle 2 hours of psychological warfare that preceded the climax paid off well and rewarded the viewer's patience. This is a film that drastically improves with multiple viewings. With an enhanced perspective, one can step back and truly appreciate the intricate emotional web Campion weaves in her unconventional, subversive Western. Classic or modern, the Western genre has never been one of my favorites. That could have been an ingredient to my impatience towards The Power of the Dog. But unlike a majority of Westerns, Campion's film includes no brash shootouts, there's no archetypal sheriff character, and there's no clear distinction between the good guys and the bad guys, between the heroes and the villains. The Power of the Dog can safely fall under the category of anti-Western, but its subversive nature isn't limited to the morally gray area it ultimately operates under. Many anti-Westerns and revisionist Westerns of yesteryear have gone to similar places. What separates The Power of the Dog from the overwhelming majority of Westerns is its undermining of the traditional Western protagonist, the strong, rugged man who taps into his masculine fortitude to uphold his principles, or to exact revenge, or to save the damsel in distress. George Burbank and his newlywed Rose play a large role in the plot, but the primary function of their union is to exacerbate the antagonism between Phil Burbank and Rose's son, Peter. By standards of rugged bravado, Peter is an effeminate young man. Bookish and creative, he prefers to spend his time arranging photo albums, crafting flowers out of paper, and studying his medical craft. Not exactly Clint Eastwood. When we meet Phil, we are inclined to believe that he will fill the masculine void, but as it turns out, his brand of masculinity is one perpetuated by needless cruelty, exaggerated machismo, social posturing, and is fueled by a deep inner insecurity. The battle that ensues between the two is as subtle as Campion's direction, and is fought on the tenuous battlefield of emotion. For many, the climax and implications of that emotional war may be cloudy. That could be due to the delicate way Campion portrays the events, but in my view, the sequence of events that lead to Phil's demise is quite clear. Peter, a devoted son to his widowed mother, vows to protect her, as he believes is his masculine duty. Phil, deeply dependent on his relationship with his brother, feels threatened when Rose enters the picture and embarks upon an intimidation campaign that, if successful, will lead to either Rose's exodus or her demise. While Peter's away at college, Phil wins many battles, but softens up to Peter, who capitalizes on the opportunity to lay siege to Phil's emotional vulnerabilities. Going in for the kill, Peter takes advantage of beneficial circumstances and gives Phil the rawhide, diseased with anthrax, with the knowledge that it will infect his open wound and kill him. And in the end, Peter can finally relax and crack a smile, knowing that his mother can live out her life peacefully with George. The Power of the Dog flips the dynamic of rugged manliness on its head, with the effeminate man coming out on top by an indirect form of warfare. One possible interpretation of the film is as a cautionary tale against what some would term toxic masculinity, and how its application can and will lead to your ultimate downfall. But in my opinion, this interpretation is far too simplistic to be satisfactory. It doesn't give enough credit to the depth of character on display in this film. It also suggests that Peter's brand of masculinity is a worthier alternative to Phil's, but this doesn't really hold, mainly due to the fact that Peter, regardless of justifications or rationalizations, is a murderer and displays several sociopathic traits on top of being a conniving schemer. To squeeze as much meaning out of this film as possible, there's no better place to start than with the title. The power of the dog is taken from the Bible, Psalms 22:20. The exact quote that is shown at the end of the movie, and I believe is from a King James version of the Bible, reads, "Deliver my soul from the sword, my darling from the power of the dog." Different translations of the Bible interpret this quote differently. In my own Bible, the latter half of the quote reads, "Spare my precious life from these dogs." Since most of the book of Psalms was written by King David, the obvious connection to make with the title is that Peter was the underdog who utilized his strengths to defeat a more formidable foe, just like in the story of David and Goliath. But I think it's safe to say that there is more to the quote than just that alone. Dogs don't feature too prominently in the film. We see a pack of them in one scene when Peter first comes to the ranch, and they encircle him and nip at his heels. All it takes for them to leave Peter alone is a whistle from Phil. The most significant dog to appear in the film is the shadow cast on the side of the mountain that can only be seen by Phil, Peter, and Bronco Henry. This key motif of the dog shadow is perhaps the most ambiguous aspect of the film. The ability to see it could be an acknowledgement of the effeminate sensibility shared by the three men. But I believe that Peter and Phil are able to see the dog shadow for different reasons. Phil epitomizes the power of the dog, and Peter is merely cognizant of that power within Phil. Regarding the context of the Bible verse, David composes the entire chapter as a desperate plea for deliverance to an indifferent or absent God. David's state of distress mirrors the mental anguish Phil inflicts onto Rose. Up until Peter can save his mother from the emotional tyranny she suffers from, she can only seek deliverance from the bottle, which ironically only gives Phil more ammunition to gaslight her with. To expand his metaphor for his need for salvation, David compares his struggles to a number of different animals, such as lions. That calls into question why Thomas Savage, the author of the source material, would specifically single out the power of the dog, a far less formidable foe. In today's world, dogs are almost universally seen as cute and lovable. Any reference to man's best friend may automatically conjure up a mental image of a beagle dashing through a snowy backyard with an ugly sweater and wool boots on. But although dogs were domesticated by humans long ago, the context in which the Bible refers to them may be as wild pack animals that scavenge on the weak and vulnerable in order to survive. This is a context in which we can understand Phil Burbank as possessing the power of the dog, a twisted oxymoronic power to prey on the weak that he displays in his emotional torturing of Rose and in the way that he beats on his defenseless horse. It's all too easy to label Phil Burbank simply as a reprehensible human being and file him away into the vast cabinet of characters. But to dismiss him like this is also to dismiss any lessons we can learn through his character and his actions. Phil isn't a nasty character simply for plot convenience. He, like any other human being, is an amalgam of his life experiences and circumstances. Phil is obviously a homosexual, and because of that fact and the societal standards he's expected to conform to, he's unable to live an authentic life. Whereas Peter is driven by his passions and is comfortable in his character, Phil is more like a caged dog that lashes out at you if you venture too close to him. Through subtext and innuendo, The film suggests that Phil had a romantic relationship with his deceased mentor, Bronco Henry. Phil's background didn't begin with working in honest dirt. We find out that he was highly educated and graduated from Yale with honors. He uses his Yale degree to make his brother feel intellectually inferior and little else. Phil's stubborn embrace of the rancher lifestyle is a way for him to maintain a dissolving connection to Bronco Henry. Phil even refuses to wash himself in a similar way that someone might refuse to wash their hands after shaking with a celebrity, as if the act of taking a bath in the civilized manner might wash away the emotional residue of Bronco Henry. No one would be surprised to discover that a ranch in rural 1925 Montana wasn't exactly the most progressive or inclusive environment. Ironically, by gripping onto the lifestyle that keeps his spirit aligned with Bronco Henry, Phil makes a Faustian bargain. To stay linked to the past, Phil sacrifices any chance of living an authentic life. This problem is made worse by virtue of Phil's high social status as a leader of the flock of cowhands. Without Bronco Henry, his influence over them is all he has, and with Phil harboring his salacious secret and sensing a need to guard it, he develops a form of masculinity that is an overcompensation of the era's ideal standards. The person that the cowhands and ranchers respect is not the true Phil Burbank, but a mask he puts on, a persona he projects. As the Swiss psychoanalyst Carl Jung said, the persona is that which in reality one is not, but which oneself as well as others think one is. When we see Phil Burbank through the lens of an insecure man who lives in the past and represses his true self, we can begin to understand how his personality soured and how he decayed into the bitter person he was in the film. Phil was the author of his own downfall. His only true relationship, the only one that mattered to him, was the one he shared with his brother George. But his bitterness is partly what drove George to pursue Rose and set the course of Phil's tragedy in motion. Whether Phil pursued Peter as a potential romantic partner or to simply reciprocate the guidance Bronco Henry provided for him when he was Peter's age is ultimately unclear, and I think unimportant. What I'm the most interested in with The Power of the Dog is not the implications the film has on modern masculinity, but the statement it makes on living authentically and the obstacles that can surround that. The characters of Peter and Phil provide a pristine dichotomy between living authentically and unauthentically. The juxtaposition between the two poses a question worth pondering. Does the responsibility for living a life true to yourself rest upon the individual or the collective? From a biological standpoint, it's clear why many in today's day and age believe that society as a collective should conform to the flexible nature of human desire and not the other way around. Inclusivity and diversity of opinion and taste are principles in vogue currently, and these are principles worth standing up for. But although human nature may appear to have been tweaked or altered by emerging technologies and philosophies, we as a species have changed very little, and maybe not even at all. Stripped down to the most basic sequences of our DNA, Homo sapiens are social creatures, and generally we can only thrive in social circles and in societies. This aspect of our species is ironclad and is responsible for civilization and the great surplus that many of us enjoy today. In our hunter-gatherer days, inclusion in the group ensured survival, and exile meant certain death. This instinct is still very prevalent in us today. It's the reason why Phil Burbank carries on with a life that makes him miserable. Yes, he wears his social mask to keep a connection to Bronco Henry, but at a certain point the lines between persona and authenticity blur, and Phil becomes too entrenched in his community to exile himself in search for greener pastures. Like countless others before him and after him, Phil is foisted into a bitter existence to compromise to the societal pressures and demands of the collective. As we march into a new year, we're more inclusive and welcoming of ideological diversity now than ever before, and often we're better off for it. This drive for inclusivity could come from an empathetic knowledge of the fear of exile. It could even mark the beginning of a shift away from strict societal enforcement of values, but I don't believe that this is the case. We're simply kidding ourselves if we choose to entertain the idea of moving completely past societal enforced derision of undesirables. It is too potent a weapon in the arsenal of charismatic, idealistic, and unscrupulous leaders to just sit there and collect dust. When any collective is aligned in their values and principles, they impose tremendous power over nonconformists and will regard them as undesirables, and naturally will seek to compel conformity or simply weed them out, thus promoting emotional imprisonment by oppressive means. Simply imagine the fate of Phil Burbank if he came out as gay to his fellow cowhands. To put it lightly, he would have lost the respect of those who previously looked up to him, and Phil would have been exiled. But the Phil that existed to the cowhands wasn't the real Phil Burbank, just an outward invention of his repressed self. It undoubtedly would have been a struggle for Phil to live authentically under these circumstances, but considering the inner torment he endured and the shortness of life in general, it would have been in his best interest to blaze a legitimate trail for himself. Whether that meant bracing the ridicule he would have faced on the ranch or leaving the ranch and the past behind altogether, I think is irrelevant. Thus, I believe that the onus of living a true life according to one's authentic self ultimately falls upon the individual. Attempting to control a collective is far too daunting a task for anyone to carry out successfully. We have true control over ourselves, our relationships, our choices, and our decisions, and almost nothing else. And we have a duty to be true to ourselves, because making a Faustian bargain in the way that Phil does, as we see in the film, is not worth the compromise. Phil's downward spiraling arc is tragic, and does elicit some sympathy, but they are due to the choices he makes. By repressing his true self, Phil alienates the people close to him, and he takes his frustrations out on the vulnerable as a response. He is the very definition of a weak man, and at the end of the day, he alone is responsible for his weakness and for his untimely demise. On the other hand, by embracing his uniqueness and individuality despite the ridicule and socially enforced derision, Peter uses his strengths to his advantage to rescue his mother from the power of the dog.